Yeah, thanks, Vi. And I really liked how you summarized the morning we've had so far. I think when we think of data, we kind of think of it at two levels. One is, of course, the technology layer, in a sense, the hard programming, design, etc., that you have. And then, of course, who uses it, the community that uses it. And I think at these two levels, we are seeing that, the whole vision that everyone here has, that most people have, of solving real life problems using data and technology, run into two big problems. At the stack level itself, quite often, and, the capital is part of the reason maybe, but also sometimes the imagination of people who design these systems, quite often it becomes focused on a particular problem, becomes focused on a particular functional area. And quite often it also becomes a little bit of a silo accessible only to a certain set of people. And like we heard, I mean, there's tons of data available already, Is it just available in a form that's easily used, shared, built upon? I think that's the first. Something wrong with the mic? I don't know. Am I holding it wrong?
It's working now.
Okay. So the first problem is really this whole, design layer. If it's a, infrastructure being put in place for the future, is it being put in place in a way that can really communicate not just with the imagination of today, but imagination of future actors? I think that's the first. Moving to community, which is the other really important layer. I think, sorry. Yeah, I think the other important layer is community. And there it really is a somewhat different problem, especially in the non-profit sector. I mean, we've seen in the private sector, for instance, when you have a stack that's easy to use, actors can build upon, magic can happen. We've seen it happen in the financial payment space, for example. But why does the same thing not happen in other real life problems? And here, I would say maybe what at least we've seen is it's not just about talent. Talent is a big thing, for non-profit sector. Talent is not there. It's also a little bit to do with funding and capital, which is again not sufficiently available for talent to become, in a sense, pervasive. But I'll also go one step back to say, is there actually a desire and a wanting of technology and data to be used extensively? And I'll just give you a small illustration before I hand it over. We were talking to someone who heads a really impactful organization working very many years in the country. Works with women, works in cities, and the kind of even thought process of, is technology important to us? It was just missing, because if they had $1 extra, it's not going to go into either technology, it's not going to hiring really good data person, because the ability to visualize what can happen with technology and data and unlock that imagination even at a community level, at least I felt was not sufficiently strong. And therefore, what excites me about this project is really the ability to maybe unleash that imagination, but maybe more about that later. And
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll come to talent later in the next round of questions. But Neera, I'm going to hop over to you.
So I think your original question was kind of what will it take for us to really think about scale and even scaling data, right? So I think the biggest challenge, just to build on Shilpa, is just how funders are and how funders have been giving historically, have been giving in silos, have actually not been supporting what community needs are. And it's not that you can, for example, we have a collaborative supporting adolescent girls. She needs education, health, agency. But when you fund in these silos, that funding ends up going towards implementation, and those organizations, therefore, are siloed. So I actually think but the problem is the way that the capital itself is designed. However, I think there is now movement, at least in India, we're seeing a lot more openness to begin collaborative. So as Dasra, which means enlightened giving, when we started, 24 years ago, we raised Giving Circle money, and then we supported one NGO, and we really tried to get this one NGO all that it could to be able to scale. And some of our success stories are like Educate Girls, Magic Bus, Akshay Patra. But now we've seen actually there is real power in building a collaborative platform where you can actually look at outcomes, you can have a portfolio approach, you can have pooled funds. So one way to get ahead of the way the funder is to actually do these pooled funds and build these platforms. And that's where you'll see the real power potentially of data. I think that some of the conversation for us has been largely around data, but there's a lot more going on that I think we need to talk about. And we've talked about capabilities and talent, and maybe we're getting there, but I think ultimately it is also the capabilities of those on the ground, right? And for real systems change, if you see, we've all come out from on the back of COVID. It was actually frontline workers, NGOs that in fact responded to this kind of health crisis. And I bring this up because what we need to look at more is these intersectionalities. I know we've said multidisciplinary, but I think intersectionality is going to be even more important for us, especially as we look at climate, because as a country, we haven't actually been tackling issues of climate. We're doing it much more from a mitigation, from a carbon sense, that now you're seeing, and it could be a little bit of the G20 excitement, but there is a lot more around looking at this intersectionality. And that's where you'll see real power of data will be, let's get organizations and communities to begin to track the intersectionality and moving away from implementing kind of end to end. So even though you do run collaborative platforms, if you see the kinds of stuff that Professor Cole presented or they presented, they're very comprehensive programs. They're very difficult to actually scale and replicate. And so if you can break down components, right, parts of the process or parts of the intervention and measure that, where was the real impact, that's where we're seeing government actually be able to take that up. And for us in India, government is a key player for us to be able to scale. So when you have collaborative platforms, you have a solid group of organizations who are engaging on policy and engaging with the government. So I really think some of this structure is how we can achieve scale.
We'll save the government discussion because there's a panel that my colleague is going to lead later. I want to focus on this concept of ecosystem, which is marvelous, because there are things we need to do to land the ecosystem. But I'll come back to that in my second round of questions. Now I want to still focus on challenges. Emma?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. I'm already energized by the conversation I've heard. I agree wholeheartedly with the challenges my fellow panelists have raised. I'm going to present another one to kind of build off of that, which is that I think when we're designing interventions, we're not designing for scale. We're designing for pilots, for POCs. We're risk averse as funders. And so as a result, we try and make it as small as possible and channel our funding towards a very specific area. But then we're actually not thinking about what is the scale plan? What is the design we need to make it work at scale? Because POCs, pilots, they work, right? And then we're like, why haven't we gotten this to scale? And it's because we haven't done the thinking up front to figure out what that scale plan looks like. And I think that's in part because of the way that funders think about philanthropic capital. And I think we should start to think about philanthropic capital as a lot more risk-taking than I think historically we have. When you look at the spectrum of capital, I would argue that it is actually probably one of the most risk-loving forms of capital, but that is a totally different way of thinking about philanthropy than I think funders have traditionally thought about it. So I think, in order to design at scale, we need to really think about who we're bringing to the table. Government is, of course, key. They need to be involved in the beginning because they're often a pathway to scale. But I think more importantly, it's having that end user, at the core of whatever you're designing. They're there from day one to help you design this intervention. And then you're also thinking about, channels like the private sector, right? The private sector and not just funders like me in the private sector leveraging, my broader company's philanthropic capital, but like the actual business model behind it, right? And how are you getting private sector involved in that program design as well from day one? Because they're only going to do it if it works at scale, right? They're only going to invest in dollars in. And so leveraging philanthropic capital to kind of test the risky idea at scale and proving the business case from the beginning, knowing that's your mission, means you've unlocked a more risk-taking form of capital in future from the private sector.
Thanks so much. So, I mean, building off of what my fellow panelists have said, I think one of the main barriers to, for some of this work to be done at scale, is this is this sort of tyranny of pilots, right? I hear your point on like philanthropic funding itself being risk averse and so on. But in addition, going back to the ecosystem thing, right? One reason why we, I think, stick to pilots is in the absence of genuinely collaborative ecosystems where there are different players, academics, practitioners, bureaucrats, consultants, hired by the bureaucrats to tell them what they should be doing and things like that. What often happens is that too many organizations end up being all things to different people, and as a result, the choice of like drilling down into your comparative advantage and sort of focus on implementing that at scale, either doing research at scale or like implementing the same type of thing but in different geographies, I think that often suffers, right? So even if there was interest from funders, and I mean, I'd like to believe that open philanthropy is unusually risk-taking, and we believe in this thing called hits-based giving, where we expect most of our grants not to work, right? But it's okay as long as if in expected value terms, right, it's able to like meet our bar. Despite that, one challenge often is that many of the proposals are very geography specific, are repeating pilots that somebody else has done with like minor variations elsewhere, things like that. So I think building off of each other in a constructive way, that's a challenge. The other barrier, honestly, is also talent, right? The ideal candidate for even sort of entry-level roles with many sort of non-profits, especially in my area, which is air pollution, and I think this is true for climate, and, is somebody with like a reasonably interdisciplinary training, but with like strong technical skills in one domain, and this is something we're expecting of like a 24-year-old or something, which I think is heroic, right? And so I think that's often a challenge. I mean, also because I think one barrier from the employer's side is that these organizations are typically small, they're lean, they're unable to invest in training and so on as much as would be ideal. And so you would want these fully crafted products that frankly don't exist in the number and scale that we need, which is one reason why I'm deeply excited about this program. I was fortunate to be in the part of the selection process for the universities. Really excited to see what comes of it. Climate and health, air pollution falls very firmly in that intersection. It's been a really nice learning experience. Thanks.
Great. I wish we had like an hour, but I'm going to try to bring this home, and I'm going to ask you very specific questions to sort of give us recommendations on the way forward. Yeah. But here's what we have heard so far from funders. It's hard to design at scale because funders are risk averse. Yeah. And we need a way to build on each other's work because we need those actors to sort of achieve scale. Collaborative funding is the future and the way to go. And we need to move away from pilotitis. And so what that is leading us towards is an ecosystem approach, a collaborative funding approach. But that's hard. So now I want to ask you very specific questions based on your organizational goals and your role. First, Shilpa, I'll start with you. What needs to change in the funding of data for social impact that will accelerate sustainability for the whole nation of India?
Yeah, thank you. And my alphabet for the day was C as well. And it was exactly the two words that Professor Kundu used, which is collaboration and community. When I look at and talking about the technology layer, really to my mind, like getting, data sets and the infrastructure to be kind of a lot more interoperable, collaboratable, is really the way to go. And I'll just leave a thought behind like NDAP, which is something, again, it was a small pilot that was done where a PMU was funded at Niti Aayog to set data standards and to get a lot of government data in one place, accessible to all. And the beauty of that pilot is at some stage it was government itself which took this and put government funding into it and institutionalized it. And I think, like, to my mind, it brings together not just, the idea of collaboration and collaboratable, work, but also getting government collaboration in. So that's the first on the technology layer. On community, I think, I agree that pilotitis is a danger, but there is a little bit of merit in it, which is that, a lighthouse project can actually create the desire. If this lady who I was speaking about, if she saw that, okay, there's that large NGO which has used data and has got this fantastic data officer and it's cut their cost to delivery by 80%, So I feel there is a power of lighthouse projects, and I think some of the work you're doing, I hope it will lead to that. The third one is really that, even interventions like this have really a limitation because there's only that many fellows you can put out, only that many organizations that philanthropy can fund. And therefore, how do you kind of just make the talent pool so pervasive, in a sense, almost drop the price point of a data officer? I think that's really the third level of challenge for making it national level success.
I will save talent for you, Neera and Santosh, so I'm just priming you right now. But I'm going to move on. The same question to you, Neera, because it's really important to be strategically aligned. What are your thoughts? And you use the right phrase, collaborative funding. How do we move forward with that?
So I think instead of poo-pooing on pilots, I think the power of pilots has been innovation. So I think innovating and iterating is really important for us, and that data will underlie our ability to do that and respond a lot quicker. But that's just an aside. I think two things that we should talk about more is power and trust. And when we start looking at data, frankly, even when we start looking at climate, there's this element of privilege, and there's element of like, we're the data scientists and you're the community, or we're the funders, and you're the NGOs, and somehow we are going to empower everyone else. So I think some bridge building is absolutely necessary for collaborative work to work. And it's not tom-tying Dasra per se, but it is that there will be a role in the ecosystem for more and more bridge builders. And actually, that's a special talent. Even though, I came from a stats and a math background, I went to Harvard Business School, but there's certain roles each of us coming from our own training and backgrounds can play to be able to bridge to each other, but that has to fundamentally come from building trust, but also recognizing power. And funders, behind a funder is talent. They're not talented in data, so who are they to say they should be funding X, Y, Z? And I love the accelerator report, but it doesn't talk enough about build capacity of funders. Because if you're going to drive that kind of capital, then shouldn't there be data experts sitting there and then share that data? if you're going to constrain NGO resources in the first place, or they are constrained, it's not about finding cheaper talent. I don't think that's the solution. But can you do shared services? Can you do shared talent? Why can't funders think about building backbones and things like that that will enable for building that capability and accelerating it, rather than all of that actually being, on your books, is what we need to think about. And then finally, trust. No matter what, ultimately, it is the community that is sharing that data. And are we building an environment where there's a willingness, where they are protected, where that aggregate data ultimately is used by them for them to exercise sort of their rights and entitlements? But I see the stop sign, so I'm going to stop.
Shilpa, how can you do this to us? Did you see us just taking off at an altitude? I'll just crave your indulgence, 3 minutes, because I don't want to shortchange what Emma and Santosh have to say. You've heard talent. So let's shift it to your views, specific recommendations on talent capacity building.
Yeah, definitely. So I think at the center, we think about talent as supply and demand. So of course, on the supply side, working with educators to, actually equip the data practitioners of the future with an interest in social impact. I think that's first. And then second, the kind of language they need to interface with social impact organizations and do it effectively. A great example we have is actually in the US with Howard University. We've partnered with them to help build out their Data Science for Social Impact Center, and actually look at how racial bias finds its way into a lot of the data work that is being done in financial services and in healthcare. So that's on the supply side. On the demand side, I really think we have to think about the talent of social impact organizations. I chuckle a little bit, Neera, because I'm not a data expert. I am a funder, but I'm not a data expert. And I actually have amazing team members at the center who are data experts and luckily make our funding decisions in that regard. Capacity building for social impact organizations is a key place that we have to consider and build. Again, it's often shared language, right? Like talent needs to be able to talk to one another, so you need talent in all places. Working with organizations like DataKind, for example, which is focused on digital and data maturity of social impact organizations and helping equip them with the language that they need to work with data practitioners or hire data practitioners or whatever it might be.
Thanks. Very quickly. I think the experiential learning component is quite critical, ensuring that there is sustained engagement between sort of nonprofits and so on, and folks who are going through programs like this. I think that's crucial, partly as a way of like creating the stage for like future employment and so on, but also for the students to get a sense of like the messiness of the sector and potentially starting their own thing by identifying gaps. The other is that, especially for folks who are looking to build skills in data, I think my prior would be that, especially in India, more often they would come from like a fairly technical background of a specific kind. To be working in climate and health, you would need a reasonable appreciation of how government works, how society works. I think just ensuring that that's somehow part of the, that's a hard thing to build into curricula, but I think that's an important component of it.
I just can't thank this panelists enough. Just give me 30 seconds to wrap up. This has been super brilliant. We've reached a consensus. The status quo is not working. It's fragmented and super siloed. And something's got to give. So what's got to give is a future of funder coordination that really relies on collaboration and community involvement. But that needs work. That's why we need to transition from the concept of community to an ecosystem, because ecosystems don't build themselves. So there's an intentionality that is required to stitch things together, to build that lateral connectivity. There is the concept of power and trust that needs to be worked through. There's a notion of experiential learning that needs to be coded in. That's what the future of funder coordination looks like. can't wait to work with all of you. Please join me in appreciating this panel. Thank you.